year's game. That's actually the series score for Florida and Tennessee. I got to say, I was a bit surprised at the limited number of games as you look across the nation and pick out the best rivalries in college football. Typically, we're looking at a roughly 100-game series, but with Tennessee and Florida, they have a continuous series just going back to 1990 as we talk up the rivalry here at Mark Rogers TV. This is Rivalry Month, meaning in June, it's Rivalry Month at Mark Rogers TV, but we couldn't wait to get started, so we cranked it up tonight with Clemson, Florida State, and now Florida and Tennessee. So we welcome in this is the old SEC breakdown crew right here. We got Mike LaValle from Last Word on College Football and David Waters from Gators Breakdown. Don't know where he got that name, but Gators Breakdown with David Waters doing a great job covering Florida football. It's a must listen, folks. Must listen if you love college football. I even listen to it, and I don't care anything about the Florida Gators. It's that good if you love college football. So, guys, Florida and Tennessee, and the first thing that comes to mind for me is this was in the 90s. This was a game that you had to see in the 90s and early 2000s. It was a CBS night game. They only had so many night games on CBS, national games at that time, and this was typically one of their first selections. They would say, we got to have Florida, Tennessee play at night, and it was a huge game, Mike.
Yeah, it was. You talk about this is kind of a modern day rivalry, is what I'll call it. We were talking earlier. Tennessee and Florida only played 21 games in the first 67 years. But yeah, that Saturday SEC on CBS theme coming in with those guys, Vern Lundquist, and his partners throughout the years. That early September, of course, Tennessee Alabama is the third Saturday in October. Tennessee and Florida somehow got matched up playing early, usually the third game of the season. So, it kind of took on the name Third Saturday in September, which is kind of a play on the Tennessee-Alabama rivalry. But yeah, those Saturdays in the 1990s, and we can talk about this later, but that's really when the rivalry became what it is today, starting in 1990. Of course, the SEC forms two divisions. Tennessee and Florida move to the east. Of course, Alabama, the Tennessee traditional rivalry, now in the west. So that matchup creates a situation where Tennessee and Florida play every year. In the 90s, they were probably two of the top five teams every year. So that rivalry at the onset had a lot of stake into it. Plus you put in the early that game in the early season. It carries a lot of weight going down the stretch, determine who's going to play in the championship game. And then, we'll talk about this later, but then some of the personalities involved and some of the connections the schools have. But yeah, in the 90s, this was one of those great rivalries, and even early in the 2000s. But it's a modern rivalry, and there's a lot of stuff that we can talk about here on this rivalry.
Gators and Vols, David. When did you first dive into this game?
Mark, I'm 35 now, and so this was the first big rivalry that I can remember, that it was year in and year out, where, as Mike said, these teams were top 5, top 10. And, Florida, Georgia is a bigger rivalry historically. Florida State, of course, in-state ties. But Florida, Tennessee, for me, was the first big-time, big game, year in, year out rivalry where everything was on the line when these two teams played, and the SEC East was on the line. And you knew more than likely the team who won that game was one of the nation's best team and would win the SEC and would have a chance to go and play for the national championship. So, this was the game where you circled it. You knew it was going to be the first big matchup of the year. CBS actually, they wouldn't really even open up the first couple weeks of the season. This would be their first game of the season, and it would be Florida and Tennessee, and it would be the 3:30 game or a night game, and it was just always the main game and CBS's first game. And as Mike said, that the personalities, when Spurrier and Fulmer got there, and those two were matched up, and you had those great teams, and those two coaches elevated that game even more. It made it more than just a game. So, given my age and, when I first come into Florida football, I was lucky enough to come into Florida football when Florida got really good under Steve Spurrier, but this was the first big game and the first big time rivalry that I can remember, more so than Florida, Georgia. But, up there with Florida and Tennessee, or up there with Florida and Florida State, of course, because in the 90s, it was Florida, Tennessee, Florida State as premier matchups throughout the nation.
So I'm going back to, as we mentioned, the last time when the rivalry was renewed and stayed a consecutive series, obviously is connected to the SEC Eastern Division in 1990. Basically, if you track it from then until Urban Meyer left, the winner of this game was always ranked in the top 10 in the country at the time of winning this game. That's how big this game was every year, Mike.
Yeah, that's one of the things that really irritates Tennessee fans. One of the driving factors for Tennessee fans, I got a few years on David there. So for Tennessee fans, our traditional rivalry is Alabama, historically, and then growing up, particularly through the 60s, 70s, 80s. I wasn't growing up in the 60s, but Alabama's are. So for Tennessee fans, what Florida represents is in those 90s, between 95 and 2006, when Tennessee won, I think 8 of 11 from Alabama. When the SEC split to two divisions, Tennessee really saw themselves as being prepared to take that next step, and instead of playing second fiddle to Alabama, assuming that leadership role in the SEC. And then Florida comes in the 90s and really kind of takes that mantle, leading the SEC through the 90s and early 2000s. And that's really kind of what drives Tennessee fans. That's really what irritates them the most, is they were really to take the mantle of SEC leadership on when Alabama struggled in the 90s and early 2000s. Let's see, Tennessee 10-2 against Alabama in 95 to 2006. Only 3 losses from 93 to 2007. But Florida kind of come in there and just kind of leapfrog us into the leadership position in the SEC. And that's really what kind of drives Tennessee fans. We had the national championship in 98, but you can count 95 was a year that we should have won the national championship. Alabama beats us. That's the driving rain game, Peyton Manning's senior year. I'm not sorry, his sophomore year, driving rain game. We took a lead in halftime. Florida comes back, wins it. We owned Ohio State in the bowl game. That was our only loss a year. So, Florida cost us at least one national championship in 95. Probably
was I supposed to let that comment slip, Mike? The owning of Ohio State in a bowl game?
No. We can go. It's a matter of record.
20-14. It was a 1-score game.
Well, okay. Well, I think you guys scored 14 in the last 2 seconds or whatever. But 96, we also could have played for a championship. 97, we may have, but nobody was beating Nebraska that year. So Florida cost us at least one championship. And then if you look at 96 and 2000, possibly a third in the cards for Tennessee. But really, Tennessee had that window there, mid 90s to early 2000s, where we really thought we were going to assume that mantle of leadership in the SEC, and Florida kind of came in and took it right out from under us. That's really what drives the Tennessee fans with their palpable dislike of Florida.
I bet in the statement that most and best summarizes that stretch of time, I could even steal it from David, or I could set him up and give him the pleasure of saying it, what Steve Spurrier used to say about Tennessee in the Citrus Bowl.
The funny thing about that comment, Mark, was Florida ended up in the Citrus Bowl later that year. So that was
the one year when the one. Wasn't that Peyton's final year? Florida still lost 2 other games and got knocked out.
Yep. Spurrier made the comment, of course, going into that game, Florida still beat Tennessee, but did end up, like I said, losing to LSU and Georgia, and represented the SEC in the Citrus Bowl. So it was kind of funny. It was a funny comment, but ended up kind of coming full circle where Florida was actually in the Citrus Bowl that year. So that was kind of, Spurrier goes back and look at it. He still gets a lot of praise for that comment, but when you look at it in the whole picture of things, it kind of had a little bit of egg on his face there. But what's not egg on the face there, and Mike brought it up there, is Peyton Manning, Tennessee's favorite son. A lot of people say, he'd never beat Florida. And that was the one big knock of his career. And as good as he was, and there were chances, there were games where Florida got up big and he helped Tennessee storm back and almost come back and beat Florida. There was a game where Tennessee was up big and Florida comes storming back there. And then, of course, the 97 season as well. So it was that mid-90s stretch where, Tennessee probably could have won some games there, and Florida ended up, also winning, playing in a national championship in 95 and getting steamrolled by Nebraska, but then turning around the next year, beating Tennessee again and catapulting all the way to a win at their first national championship in 96. It was just that game just really, really meant something in the 90s, and we go back and and I'm sure we can get into like most disappointing parts of this rivalry for each of us there, but I'll go and fast kind of forward to 2001. Tennessee beat Florida in Steve Spurrier's last home game in the Swamp, and Florida was a huge favorite in that game, anywhere from 12 to 17 points from according to what Vegas book you were looking at. And that game was for the SEC East, a spot in the SEC championship game where that winner would play LSU and probably go on to play Miami in the Rose Bowl. And, Florida fans were really wanting to go play Miami in that Rose Bowl game, but the game got moved to the end of the year because of September 11th. And then Travis Stevens in Tennessee come in the swamp and put it on Florida, and he runs for, over 200 yards and really puts it on
226.
Yeah. So, it was, Florida's one of Florida's worst defensive performances under Spurrier. And Florida probably was counting their chickens a little bit before they hatched there, but that was a top 5 matchup there, and that there was a really good Tennessee team. And they were disappointed in the way that season ended after losing to LSU. But that game had all the marbles again, that mid-90s feel. And Florida, a lot of people say, a lot of Gator fans say that 2001 team was the best team to never. The best team not to do anything for the Gators, and a lot of it was because that season-ending loss to Tennessee.
You guys are so much more equipped to carry on this conversation, so I'm going to shut up after this comment. You guys can just talk because the 2 Peyton games that you bring up, Dave, I remember actually, I think this is how my mind works. I remember the score, I believe, at halftime, because you mentioned the one game that I think Florida scored 35 points in the first half. It was like 35-6, and then Peyton brought them back. They didn't really have a realistic shot, but they had a shot with an onside kick with seconds left to possibly pull off the upset, but they lost like 35-29. The other game that was just a shocker to me, and Mike will know the exact year of Peyton's reign there in Knoxville, was the game that they went up like 31-14 at the half, and then Florida just like 62-37 comes storming back.
Yeah, that's the 95 game. That's what they call the rain game. David, I think that was Grossman's year. Tennessee went up. They scored.
95 would have been Warfel. Okay,
well, yeah, that's right. Warfel. That's right. It's the Warfel story because SI was going to put Manning on the cover.
Yeah.
And so they went up. Florida scored right before the half, and then come out and just blitz Tennessee in the second half. A pouring rain. I mean, I remember watching that game on TV. It was just a deluge. And I was thinking to myself, at halftime, I'm thinking to myself, oh, rain, just keep raining. That'll shut down Florida's passing attack. And Danny Warfel come out, probably the best passing performance I've ever seen in heavy rain. I mean, he just couldn't miss. The receivers didn't drop anything, and I believe they torched Tennessee for 62 total points. I think Tennessee may have had either a field goal or 1 touchdown in the second half, but it was abysmal. I mean, it was just a horrible second half for Tennessee. Warfel lit it up, and then he ended up on the cover of SI that next weekend. But that's the rain game in 95. That's Peyton's sophomore year. David,
yeah, it was kind of funny because that game is in Knoxville, and you see all the stands there, and as you said, the deluge. There was probably as much yellow rain jackets there as there were the orange in the stands and the blue in the stands, just because of that heavy rain there. But yeah, also just the Spurrier. The Spurrier angle to this, we keep talking about the mid-90s was because of, Johnson City, Tennessee, and a lot of talk of him going to Florida instead of Tennessee for his career, and, how different would it have been for both programs if Steve Spurrier never goes to Florida and ends up going to Tennessee at a high school there. And, you have to maybe go back to the 60s and kind of, it made the path for probably what both programs kind of are right now. If Steve Spurrier would have followed the same path at Tennessee that he did at Florida and success there, from Tennessee, as I mentioned, ends up going to Florida. So, Steve Spurrier, his being, born and raised in Tennessee there and going to Florida, kind of, it's weird kind of how it sets this rivalry up.
Yeah, Mark, I'll expound on that. I talked earlier about when you get some of these modern day rivalries, you don't have some of those ties to the schools that a lot of places or a lot of old school rivalries do. You talk about Georgia and Auburn. You got Vince Dooley and Pat Dye, coaching the other school from whence they came and stuff like that. Tennessee and Florida, even though they weren't a big rivalry until the SEC split, they do have a lot of ties, and that Spurrier ties is first among them. Tennessee fans don't really knock Spurrier for not going to Tennessee. Tennessee ran a completely run-based offense at the time, kind of a single wing offense at the time. Spurrier was a passing quarterback, went to Florida, won a Heisman. There was really no animosity for the East Tennessee kid leaving for Florida. What really kind of got under the skin of Tennessee fans is when he comes back to Florida and, he takes the digs at Tennessee. That was kind of the beginning of the information age. So these speeches that coaches used to give at the touchdown clubs and the booster clubs, coaches had always been doing that to motivate their fans and motivate their boosters. But this was the beginning of the information age when people would actually record things and videotape them and then publish them out on the news. So Spurrier was very good at that. Fulmer wasn't that good. Fulmer was more of a, a good old boy, country boy kind of type, and wasn't as comfortable in front of the mic as Spurrier was. Fulmer was a great coach, but back in those days, he wasn't the PR guy. He's much better at it now. Spurrier was much more comfortable, and he kind of won the PR war. That's really what got under Tennessee fans about Spurrier. It wasn't that he left spurned Tennessee in college, because he did what he needed to do there. It was just that he owned us in the PR game in those mid-90s. You look at Doug Dickey; he's another connection in the rivalry. Played at Florida, Dave can tell you about that, but then coached at Tennessee. A lot of the traditions that Tennessee created, the checkerboard end zones, running through the power T, those were put in place by Doug Dickey in the 60s. He leaves Tennessee after a successful stint, I believe a 5 or 6 year stint at Tennessee, to go coach at Florida, and then comes back later in his career to be a very successful athletic director at Tennessee. And then, of course, there's the Ron Zook, which is kind of the villain of the series. He assistant coach at Tennessee. Then when he took over at coach at Florida, had some guys fax Tennessee's game plan to Florida in the 91 game. A former coach, Jack Sells, faxed Zook the Tennessee offensive game plan, probably cost us the 91 game as well. So for a modern rivalry, they've got the ties of the personalities already there, really with Spurrier and Dickey, and then kind of Ron Zook having some commonalities there between the two schools as well.
Dave, I'm looking at these scores, and I see Urban Meyer has quite the reputation both at Florida and Ohio State for beating his rivals. Of course, that's not only Tennessee, but it's Georgia as well. But didn't realize that 06 championship team that squeaked in because Michigan was dropped in the polls also just squeaked by Tennessee 21-20 that year.
Yeah, it was in Knoxville there, and lo and behold, it's that was probably the biggest emergence and spotlight Tim Tebow was in as a true freshman when we first got to see him in that big time stage. It was converting to third and shorts and converting the goal line situations into touchdowns. And I remember a big pass from Chris Leak to Cornelius Ingram to tight end there. And that was a very tough game going up to Knoxville and taking that away. And going back to 2005 too, Meyer's first year of Tennessee was a highly ranked team coming in, and they didn't end the season too well, but that was a top 5, top 10 matchup there as well. And Tennessee comes into town, and Urban Meyer, that was his first big rivalry win there. And he made it a point when he come to Florida. You got to beat Tennessee, you got to beat Georgia, you got to beat Florida State. And it started that night, and that's kind of was the spark for Urban Meyer. And it was a low, ugly scoring game, 16-7 in 2005. Another, and that Florida offense didn't really get going up until 2007. So those games against Tennessee were close, but like among many others there. But you go back to that 2006 season, and that was kind of the emergence of Tim Tebow and us kind of knowing the type of player that he would be in that 2006 season when they went up there to Knoxville to get that win. And kind of talking about the personalities, Mike was just talking about also recently in these personalities when we had just a couple years ago when Tennessee stormed back and beat Florida, and all the hype going into that game it was after the Greer to Callaway 4th and 14 and Florida winning in 2015, but 2016 Florida's going up to Knoxville and Tennessee's got it all going, and they had the smoky gray uniforms, and that whole week there was just so much trash talk before Florida and Tennessee. I don't know if I've ever seen that much trash talk between these two teams, and when they and they were this wasn't the 90s, this wasn't the early 2000s where everything's on the line. But this was Quincy Wilson talking about a truck pulling a duck, and who in the heck knows what that means. But it got ramped up and blown up, and all the making fun of Butch Jones and his quotes and all that stuff come from Florida fans. And Florida gets up big, 21-0, and Tennessee just comes storming back in the second half, and ends up beating Florida and ending the 11-game win streak, I believe. So just even though both teams were at the top of their game and at the top of the nation, it was that the pregame leading into that game 2 years ago was so ugly.
And there certainly wasn't any back and forth between me and Dave on Twitter. That absolutely would not have happened. But hey, that 2006 game brings up another commonality, another trend in this series. You know that Florida won that game 21-20, but Tennessee had a pick six called back on an absolutely horrendous personal foul call on a Tennessee blocker. When you see the replay, they called an illegal hit to the head on a guy trying to go after the ball. It wasn't even close to his head. So Tennessee was pretty much robbed of that game, the 2006 game, which goes back to the 2000 game, which is another game that probably cost Tennessee a chance or at least a shot at the national title when Jabbar Gaffney touches the ball for like 0.1 seconds. It's knocked out of his hands. And Al Matthews was the referee who calls it a touchdown. Of course, he was a Vanderbilt grad, was in no way, in no universe, in no zip code was it a touchdown. It wasn't even close. This was before the catch and all the discussion in the NFL college about what is a catch.
Let's just say I'm glad there was no instant replay back then.
I know, right? Clearly, this was not a catch. So Tennessee loses that 2000 game on probably the worst call in the history of college football. And then there was a couple other dubious calls, and it seems like they all go. Florida's way, but that's another trend in the series. You look back at it, unless you have money on the game, you can laugh at it now. Of course, 10 years ago, I guess 18 years ago now, it was soul crushing. That's
Dave.
sure.
Mike wasn't kidding when he said, "Man, this series gets to Tennessee fans."
Yeah, it does. I've been lucky enough, of course, like I said, given my age, where I've got to see a lot of Florida wins, and of course, Florida, Tennessee being one of them, and. Going back to Mike's point of calls, Florida fans still do feel like there's one there that didn't go their way in 2004. Florida 28-27 trying to run the clock out, and then Dallas Baker gets called for a personal foul when a Tennessee player slaps him in the head, and he retaliates and slaps back. The referee sees both of them, but Florida gets called for the penalty. The clock didn't. The referee never started the clock again after the penalty. The clock should have been running down before Florida punted the ball and left enough time for Tennessee to march down and kick a game-winning field goal there. So that's just one where the refs calls didn't go Florida's way. But to Mike's point, there is there are some of those points for that Jabbar Gaffney catch. Yeah, it was funny when you brought this up, Mark, and wanted to do this. For whatever reason, that one does kind of escape my mind. But when I knew we were going to do this, that 2000 game did come back to my mind, and I was sure Mike was going to bring it up there. But like as I said, I'm glad there was an instant replay back in 2000 because they probably would not have ruled that a catch.
There are people involved Twitter who still randomly tweet to this day, Jabbar Gaffney did not catch the ball. It just in the middle of the day, sitting at work, they'll just tweet it. Send. I mean, I'm not kidding. It happens on a very regular basis. Here's another reason why Florida really gets under the skin of Tennessee fans. For any team that Tennessee's played more than 5 times, we only have a series deficit in 3 of those: Alabama, Auburn, and Florida. With Alabama, you can think, they're one of the top 5 programs in the nation. That they're kind of the kings of the SEC, and you can hate them like Tennessee fans do, but you have to acknowledge their accomplishments. Tennessee and Auburn's the other one. I think we're 21-28 against Auburn, but that's obviously 49 games. That's one that doesn't happen every year. But Tennessee fans really think that they should be up on Florida. And so that just kind of irritates them. They kind of begrudgingly respect. I don't know if you can respect and hate a team at the same time, but that's kind of how it is with Alabama. You just have to accept that they're Alabama. But again, Tennessee fans always see themselves as a top 10 national program, and always the number 2. Statistically, they're number 2 in the SEC in pretty much everything. And so with Florida having that deficit against Florida and then not having a lot of success against Florida in the last 2 decades, that really gets under Tennessee. That really gets under Tennessee fans' skins. It's a little bit easier when the team you're playing second fiddle to is one of the top 5 historical national programs in the nation. But when you look at Florida, they've been great for 20 25 years now, but before the 70s, they weren't really, I can let Dave talk history a little bit, but they weren't really a national powerhouse. They just weren't. I mean, you can't really look at it any other way. And so for Tennessee to see kind of like what we consider an up and coming program that's only been successful for 30 years kind of leap past us in the SEC. It's not even that they're Georgia, who's been good for 100 years too, but it's Florida. Like, how did these guys who wear jorts leap in front of us? I mean, how does that happen? So that's really kind of what drives Tennessee fans nuts. Is it shouldn't happen? How do the gods of college football let this happen? It'd be different if it was Georgia, because that's Georgia, and you got to kind of give Alabama their due for what they've done. But the fact that it's Florida is one of the three teams that we have a serious deficit with. It infuriates Tennessee fans to no end.
If you guys rack up a few more 0-8s, that series advantage over the rest of the SEC is going to evaporate.
Well, we still have about 50 games on Florida and Kentucky, so that's two teams that we're going to be okay with.
Mike, you'll have a better time when we can get those series together and you can talk rivalry against Kentucky and Vandy.
Yeah, I know, right?
And just even going recently, it has to be heartbreaking for Tennessee fans just because last year's game, the Florida offense once again stinks. But you have a bomb from Felipe Franks to Tyreek Cleveland on the last play of the game. That's 2 years later, after in the swamp again. As I mentioned earlier, Greer to Callaway, 4th and 14. That Tennessee pretty much controlled that game all throughout, and Will Greer had a hot fourth quarter and a hot last drive, and Tennessee misses a field goal to pull that game out, where Florida wins by 1 point. So even lately, as I said, the two teams haven't been playing for a lot. Florida did represent the East in those SEC title games there, but it was just those heartbreaking late game heroics that helped Florida pull away and really stick it to Tennessee again.
Yeah, today's point, the last 4 years have been a microcosm of this rivalry to Tennessee fans. He talked about 2017. You got that the bomb at the end of the game that just shouldn't have happened. Well, never mind the missed holding call, but on defense, you just can't give that up. You got two guys back there. 2015, the 4th and 14 conversion. It's just like, how does this happen? And then 2014, Tennessee owned that game, but they couldn't finish drives. They had to settle for field goals. And then Florida comes down late in the fourth quarter and wins another game. All four of those games, I'm not griping here, but all four of those games, Tennessee should have won. At least 3 of the 4. In 3 of the 4, they statistically and on the field, they outplayed Florida, but Florida found a way to win. To Florida's credit, they found a way to win. And so those 4 games, the last 4 years, even under Butch Jones, the last 4 years, it is a microcosm of the rivalry. How do we manage to lose to Florida when, for a better part of the game, we played much better? So we look at this rivalry and we're like, how do we have this series deficit to Florida when oftentimes when things balance out in rivalries, you can kind of accept that, but it just doesn't seem like the bounces and the luck ever swing towards Tennessee's side, except for maybe once or twice in a decade. Again, that's part of that psychological, affliction that Tennessee fans have against this Florida rivalry. It just doesn't seem like anything ever goes our way.
So, Dave, that means look out for the next 30 years. The bounces may go the other way.
It could. Both teams got coaching changes coming up, so hopefully that's not the the reversal of fortune there. So, and Mike mentioned that 2014 game, and that was real Muschamps last year there. But it was 9-0 going into the fourth quarter, and then Florida scores 10 unanswered by taking Jeff Driscoll out and inserting Treon Harris for his kind of first action of his career, and Florida ends up winning 10-9. So that's a good point by Mike. Is it just these last 4 years is really a microcosm of the whole especially in the 90s, the whole Florida Tennessee rivalry.
That's kind of a funny narrative to listen to 4 years later. Oh, you brought in Treon Harris to come back from 9 down? Is that how that worked?
So that's another common theme in this rivalry. Tennessee losing to backup quarterbacks. CJ Leak was a brother of a Tennessee player, and of course Tebow came in as a backup quarterback. You had Treon Harris, Felipe Franks, I think spelled the starter last year. I mean, Tennessee has had horrible luck with Florida backup quarterbacks. We're probably more successful against Florida starting quarterbacks than we are against Florida backup quarterbacks. I'd have to crunch the numbers.
The beauty in the scheduling of this game is even over the last few years, you could almost say 10 years, that the programs have generally been down less than their standard that they established before that the game is scheduled so early that you can, at least as a faithful, one of the faithful, you can believe that your team has a chance in the division, and that game really means something. It's going to be what it used to be.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of what happened in 2016. Florida did lose to Tennessee. But Florida ended up finding a way to go and still go to the SEC championship game. That game being early in the season, but for the most part, the team who wins this game goes on to have a better season when it's all said and done. And Mike, there was I don't know how many years in a row where I remember every year on CBS it was the team who wins the rushing yardage wins the game. And I remember that streak being for however long it was. And that continued to hold true. That was one thing about this game is you knew going in, you had to run the ball against the other team. So, but yeah, it's this game being so early in the season, it kind of just, it sets the tone for the season. Florida would lose to Tennessee, and, you're really wondering about the rest of the season. You beat Tennessee, you start feeling good about the season and what it could hold for the remaining 9 games of the season.
Yeah, and Dave brings up a good point. For many years, it was the person who ran the ball. When you think Tennessee and Florida, you kind of think Peyton Manning, and then in Florida, you think all those Heisman Trophy winning quarterbacks, all those passing yards. But for the 90s and early 2000s, it was all about who could rush the ball better. The other thing is, for many years, the winner of this game was the SEC East representative. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it was either Tennessee or Florida. And I believe when you go back to the SEC split into 2 divisions and the SEC championship game, I think the first, Dave, help me out here, probably the first 10 years, it was the winner of this game was the East representative in Birmingham / Atlanta.
So obviously we, not to interrupt, sorry, Mike.
No, go ahead.
And I'm cutting Dave off in his glory right here, spewing off Florida championships here. But obviously 92, 93 were both the Florida-Alabama games. Mm-hmm. Alabama winning the championship, the national championship in 92, Florida coming back to win in 93. They won in 94 as well. I was at that game. Florida won 24-23, beat an undefeated Alabama team. 95 actually was an Arkansas-Florida game where the Gators just crushed Arkansas. 96 was, of course, Florida winning the national championship, and they beat
Bama in the SEC.
Bama. Yeah, they beat Alabama in 96. 97 was the Tennessee SEC win despite losing to Florida. So they beat Auburn, I believe, in 97, did Tennessee in the SEC title game.
Yep.
98 was, of course, the Tennessee run to the national championship playing Mississippi State.
Yep.
Wild card there. I was in the stadium for that one. And running to a TV shot while Peerless Price was doing his magic in the fourth quarter.
As a matter of fact, 97-98 was the last repeat SEC champions until Alabama did it 2 years ago.
Yeah, because you had and then Florida 99, 2000, 2001, Tennessee. So yeah, you're looking at definitely only Florida and Tennessee represented the East.
First 10 years. It was 92 through 2002. I just checked it. Yep. First 10 years, Florida and Tennessee were the only 2 teams to play in the championship game.
So 01, Mike, was the year that LSU knocked off Tennessee and derailed them from going to a BCS championship game, right?
Yep, 2001, yep.
So then 02 would have been the first, that would have been the first Georgia, Arkansas.
Georgia, Arkansas.
Off the top of my head. Yeah, the first breakthrough for anybody else.
Good memory. That's right.
Yep. Mark Richt's second year, right? Yeah.
I remember stupid, mindless statistics in games and matchups. Even in the Big 12, I could run them down. But that's what I do. All right, guys, man, this has been a great conversation. I would love to get something out of you for this season. If anybody's catching us for just the Florida-Tennessee talk and looking forward to 2018. So, Dave, anybody who's picking up their Lindy's or Athlons or whatever and tracking the Florida Gators, maybe in a different take or angle from you, what are you guys looking at right now?
Of course, Mark, is still the ever so popular quarterback battle. Of course, Felipe Franks, Kyle Trask, Emory Jones does Dan Mullen. He doesn't have a history of it now of rolling with a true freshman quarterback to start with. I don't think so early, but hey, we're talking Tennessee, right? Florida, Tennessee, right here. It's the 4th game of the season this year, not the 3rd. Could we see Emory Jones by that 4th game? Being a true freshman quarterback? would he be starting on the road in Knoxville as a true freshman quarterback? I do expect at some point Emory Jones will start for Florida. Does that mean Florida's still playing pretty good, but the offense is still not in sync and they're trying something different at quarterback? Does it mean the offense completely stinks and Dan Mullen just wants to try something different to throw a true freshman quarterback in there? I don't know. There's not a lot of belief in Felipe Franks. There's not we don't know what we have in Kyle Trask. There's not a lot of experience there, but we do know Dan Mullen personally recruited Emory Jones. He's the fit for the offense. So as I said, by game 4, somewhere when Florida goes to Tennessee, is he the starting quarterback? I don't know. I expect it at some point in the season. I don't know, but we'll see where it goes from there. But Florida's loaded at running back with Jordan Scarlett coming back. Can they get Malik Davis back, who is a big-time playmaker? Can they get Trayvon Grimes and Van Jefferson eligible to add to that the receiver core, make it pretty deep to add to with Kadarius Toney and Tyree Cleveland? Offensive line still has to be shored up. That's still one of the biggest question marks besides quarterback on the offensive side of the ball. And can Todd Grantham work his magic like he did at Mississippi State last year by taking that defense, who was one of the nation's worst defenses, and turning it right around in just 1 year and making it a top 10 defense? Can he come back in and get that DBU back moniker back at Florida? Can he make Florida a more aggressive, attacking style defense? Can he turn CeCe Jefferson into the Jarvis Jones type of monster that from his defensive coordinator days back at Georgia? And those are things that we're looking for coming into the 2018 season.
A lot of question marks for Tennessee as well. First of all, I think Tennessee having Jeremy Pruitt and Florida having Dan Mullen, I think those are two quality coaches. I think this rivalry is going to get back to where it needs to be. I think in the next 2 or 3 years, the SEC East is going to get back to what it always has been: Tennessee, Georgia, Florida. Those 3 teams in some order. For this game this year, again, a lot of question marks. That's the theme. David just talked about the question marks on Florida side. Tennessee, coming out of spring practice, had a ton of guys, about 20 guys on the team that didn't practice in the spring game. We had the drama with Darren Kirkland Jr. this week. He's going to come back. A lot of injury issues, Tennessee, over the last 3 years. We got to stay safe, or we got to stay healthy. But the other issue is we got a lot of guys coming in that are going to contribute that aren't coming in until the summer. Keller Chris transfer quarterback. There's going to be a quarterback battle at Tennessee as well between him and Jarrett Guarantano. And then maybe even a little pressure from the freshman coming in, Shrout, who apparently has a pretty good arm on him. Madre London's coming in from Michigan State to add depth to the running back position. Hopefully he'll be able to really move the chains inside the tackles on those tough 3rd and 3s that you got to convert if you're going to win a game like that. A lot of question marks on the defense. That's really where they've been injured over the last 3 or 4 years. Darren Kirkland Jr. seems like he's going to be back. Daniel Batuli looks like he's going to have a good year. What are they going to do in the defensive backfield? When you look at the breakdowns that have cost us Florida games in the past 4 years, it's been in the defensive backfield. Of course, Jeremy Pruitt, that's his position. That's where he coaches as a position coach. So you got to think you're going to see some technique improvement there. You got to think you're going to see some development improvement there. The question for Tennessee is they think they have some talent to compete against Florida this year. Obviously, when you talk about Georgia and Alabama, they're just not there yet. But they think they have the talent to compete against Florida. It's the 4th game of the season. Can they put it all together? Can they get these graduate transfers in? Can Pruitt and his staff take the talent that Butch Jones brought in and that they've brought in a short amount of time and develop them? When you look at really the biggest criticism of Butch Jones, he was able to bring in talent. What he wasn't and his staff wasn't able to do was to develop that talent. That's why you saw a team that on paper was probably better than Florida over the last 4 years. That's why you saw them lose 3 out of the 4 games to Florida, is because they just weren't developed from the coaching staff into what they could be. Can Jeremy Pruitt do it in a short amount of time with all these guys coming in the summer? 4th game of the season. I think the 2018 Tennessee Volunteers are going to be a different team when they play Vanderbilt at the end of the season than when they play West Virginia first game of the season. It's all going to depend on how far Pruitt can develop this team week in and week out. I think you're going to see a steady progression of Tennessee getting better every week of the season. Can they put it together enough by week 4 to beat Florida? Tennessee, Vegas has Tennessee at 6.5 over/under wins this season. I would have to go under that. So, if they're going to exceed expectations, that Florida game at home is one that they are going to have to win if they're going to make that over mark.
So we've got dozens of comments on the chat, but not anything necessarily that we want to pass on here. Nothing of note here, except on the minus side, I will let you guys know that there's one Nebraska fan in particular, Navy Thomas, who is just reminding you guys of bowl games back in the 90s of playing Nebraska. But at the same time, to be fair, I had to remind him that they did play Tennessee in a bowl game just 2 years ago and lost by 2 touchdowns. So let's be fair there. Number 2, Laura Lee is a huge fan of listening to you guys, just clamoring to have you guys back on at any time, just loving the discussion. So
absolutely.
That's good stuff.
I'll tell you right now, Mark, that 97 Nebraska team that just pulverized Tennessee in the Orange Bowl was one of probably the top 5 college football teams I've ever watched. That they were that good. They were an incredible Nebraska team.
That 95 team would have been up there too. So.
They were pretty good too. They had the right combination of size and speed back then,
yeah.
boy.
Tommy Frazier still running.
Yeah. Still breaking tackles.
Still breaking tackles.
Oh, good stuff from David Waters from Gators Breakdown. Please join him on YouTube if you would like to watch the videos. They go live with their audio or video podcast on a regular basis, at least twice during the college football season, but at least once a week the entire year. If you love the audio, you can listen to the podcast on all the major platforms. Gators Breakdown. Mike Laval, last word on college football, covering Tennessee and the nation. Great stuff from these guys each and every time. They have supported me and done a great job with everything that they do. So I appreciate it each and every time, guys.
Mark, always a pleasure.
Thank you, Mark.